In a bustling mall, a peaceful afternoon takes a shocking turn for Mrs. Ruby Jenkins, an elderly woman who finds herself falsely accused of shoplifting. With two security officers looming over her, the calm shopping trip spirals into chaos as they drag her away, ignoring her pleas of innocence. But just when despair seems overwhelming, her son Oliver, a brave police captain, arrives on the scene, determined to protect her. The confrontation escalates, revealing not just the harsh realities of misunderstanding and prejudice, but also the unbreakable bond between mother and son. Will justice be served in the face of such alarming injustice? Stay tuned as this dramatic story unfolds, leaving you with a mix of emotions from heart-wrenching distress to uplifting resolution. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Imagine a typical day at the mall, bustling with shoppers, the aroma of fresh pretzels wafting through the air, and laughter echoing from the food court. You're just minding your own business, perhaps browsing through the latest sales, when out of nowhere, you're accused of a crime you didn't commit. This was the shocking reality for Mrs. Ruby Jenkins, an elderly woman who found herself unfairly harassed by mall security. Little did the security officers know that her son was about to arrive, and the ensuing events would leave everyone in disbelief. Stay tuned to discover how this dramatic and unexpected story unfolds. It was a serene afternoon at the local mall, where the sun filtered through the skylights, casting a warm glow on the polished floors. Mrs. Ruby Jenkins, a gracious and gentle 70-year-old black woman, was enjoying her weekly shopping trip, a cherished routine that brought her a sense of independence and normalcy. With her soft gray hair neatly styled and her calming presence radiating warmth, Mrs. Ruby had a way of brightening the day of everyone she encountered. Though her movements were slower than they once were, she carried herself with a dignity that reflected her inner strength. The rhythmic click of Mrs. Ruby's cane echoed softly against the tiled floor as she navigated the aisles, each step a testament to her determination. She wore a simple yet elegant floral dress, and her gentle smile illuminated her face, a small beacon of positivity in the bustling environment. As she approached the end of her shopping excursion, her reusable bags began to fill with the day's purchases. A loaf of bread, a carton of milk, a variety of fresh vegetables, and a box of her favorite herbal tea. Though her legs felt a bit weary, she relished the independence of handling her errands on her own. As she neared the mall's exit, she took a moment to pause, inhaling deeply and savoring the tranquility of the moment before returning to her cozy home. Just then, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Out of nowhere, two security officers, clad in dark, imposing uniforms, blocked her path. Their expressions were stern, and their eyes were cold and accusatory, sending a shiver down Mrs. Ruby's spine. Startled, she looked up at the towering figures, her heart beginning to race. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you," one of the officers said, his voice low and dripping with suspicion. He crossed his arms in front of his chest, creating an intimidating barrier that made it clear they intended to prevent her from leaving. Confusion washed over Mrs. Ruby as she blinked at them, her mind racing to comprehend what was happening. "Is something wrong?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper, laced with anxiety. The peaceful ambience of the mall felt worlds away, replaced by a tension that hung thick in the air. "We've received reports that you were shoplifting," the other officer interjected, his tone sharp and accusatory as if he had already cast her in the role of a guilty criminal. Mrs. Ruby's heart sank at the words. Shoplifting? The mere thought felt like a slap in the face, her mind struggling to grasp the absurdity of the accusation. She felt her smile falter, replaced by disbelief and distress as her fingers tightened around the handle of her cane. "No, sir," she replied, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of the situation. "I paid for all of my things." In an attempt to prove her innocence, she reached into her bag, her hands shaking with nervousness as she searched for her receipt. When she finally found it, she held it up for the officers to see, but to her dismay, they didn't even bother to glance at it. The disbelief and frustration swelled within her, leaving her feeling vulnerable and helpless in the face of such unwarranted scrutiny. As the tension escalated, the situation took an unexpected turn. Unbeknownst to the officers, Mrs. Ruby's son was on his way to the mall, ready to support his mother and bring clarity to this troubling misunderstanding. Little did they know, the arrival of her son would change everything. "We need you to come with us," the first officer said firmly, his voice devoid of compassion as he disregarded Mrs. Ruby's frantic attempts to prove her innocence. Her stomach twisted in knots, a visceral response to the shocking turn of events. What was happening? Confusion washed over her, mingled with disbelief. Why wouldn't they simply check her receipt and let her go? She had always prided herself on being cautious and responsible, meticulously following the rules. Why were they treating her like this? "But I didn't steal anything," she exclaimed, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and desperation. Panic began to rise in her chest, swelling with each second as the realization sank in that they weren't listening. Suddenly, without any warning, one of the officers reached out and seized her arm with a firm grip. The unexpected force made her flinch, and she struggled to maintain her balance, nearly dropping her cane in the process. "Let go," he commanded, tugging her forcefully toward the back of the store. Mrs. Ruby's heart raced wildly, pounding in her ears as disbelief turned to sheer terror. How could this be happening to her? She instinctively tried to pull her arm free, but the officer's grip felt like iron, unyielding and oppressive. "Please," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper, trembling with vulnerability. "I haven't done anything wrong." But the officers remained indifferent, their expressions hardened. They continued to pull her with increasing force, and a sharp pain shot through her frail, tired body with each jolt. Desperately, she glanced around the bustling mall, hoping that someone, anyone, might intervene, might offer her a lifeline. Yet all she saw were faces watching her, their eyes filled with judgment and intrigue, whispering among themselves, but not a single soul moved to help. Mrs. Ruby felt utterly isolated, her heart heavy with despair. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring her vision. She had never been in trouble before, never even raised her voice at anyone, and now, in this moment of humiliation, she was being dragged through the mall like a common criminal. It was a nightmare, a horrifying, terrifying ordeal that made her feel small and powerless. Her breathing grew shallow, panic tightening its grip around her chest as the tears finally spilled over, cascading down her cheeks. Her purse, which hung loosely from her arm, slipped downward in the chaos. In the struggle, her phone tumbled out, hitting the floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo in her mind. The officer, engrossed in his task, continued to drag her toward the back room, oblivious to the little details falling apart around them. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 1 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. But Mrs. Ruby noticed everything. Her heart skipped a beat at the sight of her phone lying helplessly on the ground, a small lifeline to the outside world. Her son, Oliver, her strong, brave son, had always told her to call him if she ever needed help, and at that moment, she needed him more than ever. The thought of him, with his comforting presence and unwavering support, fueled her resolve to fight back against this injustice. With shaky hands that felt as if they might betray her at any moment, Mrs. Ruby leaned down and grasped her phone, her fingers trembling uncontrollably as she struggled to unlock the screen. The two officers were pulling her roughly, their grips unyielding, yet amidst the chaos, she managed to press the call button, desperately dialing her son's number. The phone rang once, then twice, each chime echoing her rising panic. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she heard a click. "Mom," Oliver's deep, steady voice came through the line, anchoring her momentarily in a sea of confusion and fear. Mrs. Ruby's voice trembled as she whispered urgently into the phone, the weight of her tears cascading down her cheeks. "Oliver, please come. They're hurting me. I don't know what to do." Her words came out in a choked whisper, each syllable laced with desperation and dread, but she could sense that Oliver understood the gravity of her situation. "I'm coming, Mom. Hold on. I'm coming." His reply was immediate, a promise laced with determination. Within minutes, he arrived at the mall, his heart racing as he parked hastily, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. He marched inside with purpose, scanning the area until his eyes locked onto the distressing sight of his mother, her petite frame being jostled by two imposing security officers near the back of a store. The sight struck him like a punch to the gut, igniting a fury within him. His mother looked small and fragile, caught between the two burly men, her face marred by streaks of tears that painted a picture of fear and vulnerability. They had their hands on her, gripping her arms tightly, dragging her toward a back room as if she were some common criminal. A tempest of emotions surged within him: rage, sorrow, and an overwhelming urge to protect his mother. It felt as though a fire had ignited in his chest, but he knew that he had to remain composed. Oliver took a deep breath, inhaling the cool air in an attempt to steady his racing heart. He couldn't allow his emotions to dictate his actions. Trained for high-pressure situations, he knew this was no different. Yet the inner turmoil roared like a storm within him as he made his way toward them. His eyes remained fixed on the officers. His steps were firm and resolute, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He could feel his blood boiling beneath his skin, but he forced his expression to remain stone-cold, knowing that his mother's safety was paramount. "Mom," Oliver called out, his voice deep and controlled, though it took everything in him to maintain that composure. The moment she heard him, Mrs. Ruby, though clearly shaken and frightened, looked up, her tear-filled eyes widening with a glimmer of hope and relief. "Oliver," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her fear. Just then, Captain Johnson approached the scene, his authoritative presence immediately commanding attention. He walked right up to the officers, his chest rising and falling with each steady breath, a clear indication of his intent to intervene. The gathering crowd sensed the tension, their murmurs filling the air, but the security officers seemed oblivious or indifferent to the mounting concern. "This is none of your business, sir," one of the officers snapped curtly, glaring at Oliver with a mixture of contempt and disdain. He viewed Oliver as just another upset bystander, underestimating the fierce resolve and protective instincts that drove him forward. "Step back, or we'll have to take action," Oliver warned, his jaw clenched tightly as he struggled to keep the anger that simmered just beneath the surface from boiling over. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on him, and he could feel his heart racing. He locked his dark eyes on the officer, narrowing his gaze to convey the intensity of his emotions. His voice, steady yet commanding, cut through the tension that hung in the air. "It is my business. That's my mother," he stated firmly, each word laced with authority. The officer blinked, momentarily taken aback by the sheer forcefulness in Oliver's voice. However, instead of retreating or reassessing the situation, the officer tightened his grip on Mrs. Ruby's arm, a brazen act that seemed to serve as a misguided attempt to assert dominance. Oliver's hands balled into tight fists at his sides, trembling with restrained fury. Every instinct in him screamed to knock the man's hand away from his mother, to protect her from this unwarranted aggression. But he knew he had to keep his cool. He had to navigate this situation carefully and strategically. "Your mother," scoffed the other officer dismissively, "doesn't matter. She's suspected of theft, and we're taking her to the back to deal with it. Now, unless you want to get involved in this mess, I suggest you leave." Oliver felt the fire in his chest roar even louder at the accusation, but he managed to maintain a calm exterior, focusing on the need to defuse the escalating confrontation. "She's done nothing wrong," Oliver asserted, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "You can check the receipt in her bag, but before you do anything else, you need to let go of her." The officers exchanged glances, their expressions turning defensive as they processed Oliver's words. The first officer took a menacing step toward Oliver, puffing out his chest as if trying to physically intimidate him. It was clear that he had no idea who he was up against. "You need to back off now, sir, or we'll have to call for backup," the officer threatened, his voice dripping with arrogance. Oliver's lips twitched as he almost smiled at the absurdity of the situation unfolding before him. "Call for backup?" he echoed, his tone laced with incredulity. "Go ahead." The officer hesitated, uncertainty flickering across his face as he grappled with Oliver's calm confidence. Instead of backing down, he attempted to double down, trying to use intimidation as a weapon against Oliver. I don't think you understand how serious this is. If you interfere, we'll have you arrested too." At this threat, Oliver's eyes darkened, and the fire of indignation surged within him. His patience had reached its limit. With deliberate calm, he reached into his jacket and pulled out his badge, holding it up for the officers to see. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 2 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. "I am Captain Oliver Johnson, 15th Precinct," he stated, his voice steady and controlled, yet powerful enough to command attention. "You will let go of my mother." The atmosphere shifted dramatically as both officers froze, their eyes widening in shock. It was as if the very ground beneath them had vanished, leaving them reeling in disbelief. They stammered, stumbling over their words, their faces drained of color as they processed the implications of Oliver's revelation. This wasn't just any random man who had rushed to Mrs. Ruby's aid. This was her son, Captain Oliver Jenkins, a respected police captain whose rank and authority overshadowed every single individual present in the mall. With his polished uniform and confident demeanor, he commanded the kind of respect that made even seasoned officers think twice before overstepping their bounds. "Captain," one of the security officers stammered, his bravado crumbling as he instinctively released his grip on Mrs. Ruby's frail arm. "We didn't know, sir. We were just following orders." The panic in his voice was palpable, and he took a step back, clearly shaken by the realization of who stood before him. Mrs. Ruby turned her gaze towards Oliver, her heart swelling with relief as the oppressive pressure on her arm finally eased, allowing her to draw in a much-needed breath. "It's all right, Mom," Oliver said softly, his voice steady and soothing. He reached out to place a reassuring hand on her shoulder, feeling her trembling beneath his touch. The sight of his mother in distress stirred a protective instinct deep within him, igniting a fierce desire to shield her from any further harm. "They thought I stole something, Oliver," she said, her voice thick with emotion, the humiliation and confusion evident in her words. "I didn't do anything wrong." "I know, Mom. I know," he replied, his tone firm yet gentle, his eyes filled with compassion as he tried to comfort her. He understood the weight of the accusation and the unfairness of the situation, and his heart ached for her. As the tension hung in the air like a thick fog, the officers hesitated, retreating a few steps as if they were retreating from a brewing storm. Oliver stood tall, a commanding presence that demanded respect, keeping his gaze locked on the officers with a fiery intensity that made it clear he would not tolerate any further disrespect toward his mother. "You need to check the receipt," he ordered, his voice sharp and authoritative, slicing through the lingering unease like a knife through butter. The officer who had initially accused Mrs. Ruby hesitated, clearly unnerved by Oliver's commanding presence and the weight of the situation. With a nod that conveyed a mix of reluctance and anxiety, he began to fumble through Mrs. Ruby's bag, his hands trembling slightly as he searched for the evidence that would clear her name. After a moment of anxious searching, he finally produced the crumpled receipt, glancing at it with a mix of apprehension and guilt. The other officer, who had remained quiet thus far, stood back, visibly feeling the pressure of Oliver's authoritative presence as the reality of their error began to dawn on him. As the first officer read the receipt, Oliver turned his attention back to his mother, wrapping his arm around her shoulders in a protective embrace. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I can't believe this happened to you," he murmured, his voice filled with empathy and concern. Mrs. Ruby leaned against him, finding solace in the warmth of his presence, which provided a small shield against the harshness of the world outside. "It's not your fault, honey. I just don't understand why they thought I would do something like that," she replied, her voice quivering with a mix of confusion and hurt as she struggled to comprehend the situation. The officer's eyes widened as he finally processed what he was reading, his face turning pale as realization washed over him. Ma'am, it seems everything checks out," he stammered, looking utterly flustered and embarrassed. "We're sorry for the misunderstanding." Mrs. Ruby's brow furrowed, incredulity evident on her face. "Misunderstanding? You dragged me like a criminal," she exclaimed, her voice shaky but firm, the injustice of the situation boiling beneath her skin. Her cheeks flushed with a mix of indignation and disbelief, and she felt a surge of anger rising within her, fueled by the humiliation of being treated as a suspect. "I understand that you're upset," the officer replied hastily, his voice filled with an awkward urgency, as if he were trying to defend himself from the righteous anger radiating from Mrs. Ruby and Oliver. "But we had to follow protocol." Oliver's disbelief was palpable as he shook his head in frustration, disbelief washing over him like a tidal wave. "Protocol?" he echoed, his tone dripping with disdain, each word infused with incredulity. "You call dragging an elderly woman through a mall for something she didn't do protocol? You should be ashamed of yourselves." The gravity of his words hung in the air, a palpable tension that made the officers shift uncomfortably. They exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence wavering under Oliver's intense scrutiny. The first officer's face flushed with embarrassment, and he struggled to maintain his composure as the realization of their gross overreach settled in. Mrs. Ruby stood beside her son, a mixture of gratitude and indignation filling her heart as she leaned into Oliver's steady presence. "You have no idea what it's like to be treated this way," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, but gaining strength as she continued. "I'm a senior citizen. I've spent my entire life contributing to my community. I didn't deserve to be accused like this." The second officer, looking increasingly uncomfortable, stepped forward tentatively. "Ma'am, we truly are sorry for the distress this has caused you. We had a report and you jumped to conclusions without even verifying your information." Oliver interjected, his voice rising slightly with the frustration that had been building within him. "What if this were your mother? How would you feel if she were treated like this?" His words were a challenge, a call for accountability, and the officers shifted uncomfortably once more, their faces reflecting a mix of regret and embarrassment. "Sir, we did not intend for this to escalate," the first officer said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll make sure to clarify this incident with our supervisor." "Clarification isn't enough," Oliver replied, his expression hardening as he stared down the officers, determined to ensure that this kind of treatment would not go unaddressed. "You need to take responsibility for your actions. My mother deserves respect, and what happened here today is unacceptable." If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 3 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officers retreated a few steps, allowing Mrs. Ruby and Oliver a moment to breathe. As the gravity of the situation began to sink in, Oliver turned to his mother, his expression softening. "I'm so sorry you had to go through this, Mom. I promise I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Mrs. Ruby looked at him, gratitude and love shining in her eyes. "Thank you, Oliver. I just want to forget this ever happened," she said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. As they began to walk away from the confrontation, hand in hand, the echoes of their exchange resonated within them all, a reminder that dignity and respect must always prevail, no matter the circumstances. The officers stood in the background, chastened by the encounter, reflecting on their actions and the consequences of their assumptions. At that moment, Mrs. Ruby and Oliver knew they would face the world together, united in their resolve to stand up against injustice and advocate for the dignity of all, especially those who might not have the voice or strength to do so themselves. As they exited the mall, Mrs. Ruby felt a newfound sense of empowerment, knowing that she had not only defended herself but had also instilled a sense of responsibility in those who needed it most. The officers shifted uncomfortably under Oliver's unwavering gaze, their earlier bravado crumbling as they realized the gravity of their mistake. Mrs. Ruby felt a swell of pride for her son, her heart swelling with love and admiration. Oliver had always been her protector, but now he was standing up for her in a way she had never witnessed before, his fierce determination radiating strength and resolve. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the first officer stammered, his earlier confidence dissipating as genuine remorse took its place. His eyes darted to the floor, unable to meet Mrs. Ruby's disappointed gaze. "I want your names and badge numbers," Oliver demanded, his voice firm and unwavering, brooking no argument. The authority in his tone made it clear that this would not be brushed aside. This will not go unreported." The officers exchanged tense glances, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them that they had crossed a serious line. "Yes, sir," one of them mumbled, hastily pulling out a notepad. His hand shook slightly as he scribbled down their names and badge numbers, a tangible acknowledgement of their error. Each stroke of the pen felt like a reckoning, a reminder that their actions had consequences. Once they had complied, Oliver turned back to his mother, his expression softening. "Let's get you home," he said, concern etched on his face, a protective instinct glowing in his eyes. Mrs. Ruby nodded, a wave of gratitude washing over her for her son's presence. "Thank you, dear," she said, her voice soft but filled with warmth and appreciation. The fear that had gripped her moments before began to dissipate, replaced by a comforting sense of safety beside Oliver. As they walked away from the chaos, the sounds of the mall fading behind them, Oliver felt a deep sense of relief wash over him. He knew that the officers would think twice before treating anyone so unjustly again, a small victory for those who might find themselves in similar situations. For Mrs. Ruby, the ordeal had been harrowing, but with Oliver by her side, she felt a renewed sense of strength. Together, they walked toward the exit, leaving the unsettling scene behind, but carrying forward the important lesson that sometimes standing up for what is right requires courage and support from those we love most. As we conclude this gripping story of courage, resilience, and the bond between a mother and her son, we are reminded of the importance of standing up for what is right, especially in the face of injustice. Mrs. Ruby's experience teaches us that we must not allow fear to silence us, and that love and support from family can provide strength in the most challenging moments. What have you learned from Mrs. Ruby's story? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Please comment below with one thing you've learned and how you plan to practice it in your own life. If you like this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you impactful stories.